My daughter-in-law invited 30 of her relatives to spend Christmas at my house without asking me a single question. Then she smiled across my own kitchen island and said, "Mom, just make sure the food's ready before you leave." My son looked up from his coffee, chuckled under his breath, and added, "Mom, don't make things difficult for everyone." Neither of them noticed how quiet the room became after that. They assumed silence meant agreement. They believed Christmas simply appeared every year, as if a full refrigerator, a warm oven, clean guest rooms, and glowing lights somehow arranged themselves overnight. They had no idea that before the first snowflake fell, I had already packed a small navy blue suitcase and booked myself a vacation hundreds of miles away. They expected to arrive at my house and find everything waiting for them. Instead, they were about to discover something none of them had ever stopped long enough to understand. If this story truly resonates with you, I'd love for you to tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. It's always comforting to know how many hearts are listening from different corners of the world, especially during the holidays. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 69 years old. And until that Christmas, I believed that loving your family meant quietly carrying more than your share. Looking back now, I realize that wasn't love at all. It was habit. It was years of convincing myself that keeping everyone happy mattered more than listening to the small voice inside me that kept asking when someone might finally ask how I was doing. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in the same white farmhouse my late husband, Robert, and I bought almost 35 years ago. Every Christmas since then, our home had been the place where everyone gathered. The tree always reached the ceiling in the family room. The smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey drifted through every hallway. Children raced down the stairs before sunrise, while the adults lingered over coffee in the kitchen. At least, that's how I used to remember Christmas. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the person everyone celebrated and slowly became the person everyone expected. It happened so gradually that I almost missed it myself. That Monday afternoon, only 4 days before Christmas, Lauren breezed through my front door carrying shopping bags and talking on her phone. She barely looked at me as she walked straight into the kitchen. "Yes," she laughed into the phone. "There's plenty of room. Everybody's coming." She ended the call, placed her purse on my counter, and smiled as though she were sharing wonderful news. "Mom," she said brightly, "I invited my whole family for Christmas." I blinked once. "Your whole family?" "About 30 people," she answered casually. "Maybe a couple more if Aunt Denise brings her boys." I waited for the rest of the sentence. Surely she was going to ask if that was all right. She never did. Instead, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like a grocery list. "You'll probably want to buy 2 turkeys instead of 1, she said. "And more stuffing. Oh, and Uncle Rick only drinks diet soda." She looked up and smiled. "Just get everything ready before you head out for your little trip." My little trip. That was how she described the first vacation I had planned for myself in nearly 8 years. Michael walked in just then, kissed Lauren on the cheek, and reached for the coffee pot. "Did you tell Mom?" he asked. Lauren nodded. "She's fine with it." I hadn't said a single word. Michael glanced at me for less than a second. "Mom," he said with an easy grin, "don't make things difficult for everyone. It's Christmas." I studied my son's face. He wasn't being cruel. That somehow hurt even more. He truly believed this was a perfectly reasonable thing to ask of me. Or perhaps he'd forgotten how every holiday had come together all these years. The meals, the decorations, the endless grocery trips, the wrapped gifts with neat little ribbons. None of it had ever appeared by magic. I had simply made sure no one noticed the work behind it. Lauren reached for one of my recipe binders without asking. "Your sweet potato casserole is everybody's favorite," she said. "Could you make 2 pans this year?" I gently closed the binder before she could open it. "I'll think about it," I replied. She laughed, almost amused by my answer. "Perfect. I knew you'd come around." She mistook courtesy for surrender. That evening, after they left, I stood alone in the living room watching the lights on the Christmas tree reflect against the front window. Outside, soft snow drifted across the porch where Robert used to hang wreaths every December. The house was peaceful again, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about shopping lists or recipes. I was thinking about a folder tucked away inside the bottom drawer of my desk, one that no one else in the family had ever bothered to ask about. As I walked toward my study, my eyes lingered on the small brass key resting beside that drawer, and I found myself wondering how differently this Christmas would unfold once everyone discovered what that key actually unlocked. I pulled the brass key from the drawer and held it in my hand for a long moment before placing it back exactly where it had been. It was funny how a tiny piece of metal could carry so much history. Robert used to joke that every home had two foundations. One was poured from concrete. The other was built from the person who quietly kept everything together. After he passed away 11 years earlier, I promised myself I would protect both. At first, I believed I was doing exactly that. Michael was struggling after college, so I invited him to move back home for a while. "Just until I get back on my feet," he told me. I smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "There is no clock running in this house," I answered. "You are my son." A year later, he met Lauren. She was charming in those early days. She complimented my cooking, asked about family traditions, and even brought flowers the first time she came for Sunday dinner. Robert always believed first impressions mattered, and mine of Lauren had been kind. Looking back now, I often wonder if kindness sometimes makes us overlook the smallest warning signs. They never arrive all at once. They slip quietly into everyday life. The first Christmas after they married, Lauren insisted on rearranging my dining room. "This table works better by the window," she said while moving chairs across the hardwood floor. I hesitated. "Robert always liked it where it is." She smiled politely. "Well, Robert is not hosting anymore. We should modernize things." Michael laughed softly. "She has a good eye, Mom. It was only a table." I let it go. The next year, she replaced my handwritten place cards with printed ones because they looked more elegant. The year after that, she boxed away my old nativity scene because it did not match the decorations she ordered online. "People like cleaner designs now," she explained. Every change seemed too small to argue about. Every compromise felt easier than creating tension during the holidays. Before long, I realized guests were complimenting Lauren on traditions I had spent decades creating. "You always throw such beautiful Christmas dinners," one of her cousins told her one year. Lauren smiled and accepted the praise without looking in my direction. I stood in the kitchen basting the turkey and quietly stirred the gravy. Nobody noticed. Michael drifted into the kitchen while I was washing potatoes. "Mom, Lauren gets stressed planning these gatherings," he said. "Try not to take things personally." I looked at the sink full of vegetables waiting to be peeled. "Who do you think is planning them?" I asked gently. He blinked, almost confused by the question. Then he kissed my forehead and walked back into the living room without answering. That moment stayed with me much longer than he probably realized. It was not because he ignored the question. It was because he honestly no longer knew the answer. Somewhere along the way, the invisible work had become truly invisible. Every December began to look the same. I drove to 3 different grocery stores searching for fresh cranberries because Lauren preferred homemade sauce. I woke before sunrise to prepare cinnamon rolls for children who rarely remembered to say thank you. I wrapped gifts long after everyone else had gone to bed. By Christmas morning, the living room looked effortless. That was the point. If I did everything well enough, nobody noticed the effort. One afternoon, about 3 years before that final Christmas, my daughter Rebecca stopped by while I was polishing silverware. She leaned against the kitchen doorway watching me work. "Mom," she said quietly, "when was the last time somebody cooked Christmas dinner for you?" I laughed without thinking. "That is not how this family works." She folded her arms. "Maybe that is the problem." I brushed off her comment at the time. Mothers are good at dismissing their own exhaustion. We tell ourselves we are lucky to have people to care for. We convince ourselves that appreciation does not need words. But deep inside, little disappointments begin stacking on top of each other until they become something much heavier. Last Thanksgiving offered another reminder. Lauren handed me a legal pad covered in neat handwriting. "Here is your list," she said. "Turkey, pies, drinks, breakfast for 3 mornings, extra towels, fresh flowers, and do not forget disposable containers so everyone can take leftovers home." I scanned the page. "What is everyone else bringing?" I asked. She looked genuinely puzzled. "Themselves." Then she laughed as though it were the most obvious answer in the world. Michael overheard us from the family room. "Mom, you always know how to do it best." It sounded like a compliment. Somehow it felt like another obligation. That night, after everyone drove home, I found myself standing alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by dirty roasting pans and empty serving bowls. The only sound was the steady hum of the refrigerator. I remember placing both hands on the countertop and whispering something I had never admitted out loud before. "I do not think they see me anymore." The room, of course, did not answer, but in the silence, I began hearing another voice that had been waiting patiently for years, asking whether the greatest mistake I had ever made was teaching the people I loved that I would always be there, no matter how little they noticed the cost. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, not because I had anywhere to be, but because years of routine had trained my body to believe Christmas preparations had already begun. The house was still dark, and the only light came from the small lamp beside Robert's favorite chair. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat there listening to the old grandfather clock mark each passing second. For the first time in a very long while, I did not reach for a grocery list. I simply sat in the quiet. Then my phone buzzed. It was a group message that Lauren had started. One after another, names I barely recognized appeared on the screen. Cousins, nieces, uncles, friends of friends. She had titled the conversation "Christmas at Mom's House." Not Evelyn's house, not Grandma's Christmas, just Mom's house, as though the place itself mattered more than the person living inside it. Before I could even read every message, Lauren added another one. "Everyone, feel free to arrive any time after 10 on Christmas Eve. The guest rooms will be ready, breakfast will be stocked, and there will be plenty of food. Mom always takes care of everything." I stared at the words until they blurred together. She had promised my home, my time, and my work to 30 people without speaking to me once. A few cheerful replies immediately followed. "Cannot wait. The kids are so excited. Thanks for hosting us again." Every thank you was directed toward Lauren. None of them knew I had never been asked. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have corrected everyone right then. Instead, I locked my phone and set it face down on the table. An hour later, Lauren arrived, carrying fabric samples for table runners. She spread them across my dining room table as though she owned the place. "Which one do you like?" she asked. I looked at the cream-colored linen cloth that Robert and I had bought during a weekend trip to Charleston decades earlier. It had been on our table every Christmas since. "I was planning to use the one we always use," I answered. Lauren smiled patiently, the way someone speaks to a child who simply does not understand modern trends. That one feels outdated. These pictures will look much nicer online. She picked up my old tablecloth and folded it into a neat square. We can store this in the attic. No, I said quietly. She paused. No, it stays here. For just a second, her smile disappeared. Evain, she said, dropping the word mom for the first time in years. This holiday is bigger than your traditions. Families have to evolve. Before I could answer, Michael walked in carrying boxes of disposable plates. Everything okay? He asked. Lauren let out a small sigh. Your mom is making simple things complicated again. Michael set the boxes on the counter and looked at me with tired eyes. Mom, why does everything have to be a battle? I felt something inside me settle instead of break. Who said I was fighting? I asked. Neither of them answered. Lauren picked up one of the framed family photographs from the sideboard. It showed Robert standing beside me on our front porch during our last Christmas together. Snow rested on his shoulders, and we were both laughing at something outside the frame. Lauren studied it for a moment. Maybe we should replace some of these older pictures, she said. People like updated family photos. I walked across the room and gently took the frame from her hands. This one stays, she shrugged. Suit yourself. Her voice sounded indifferent, but I noticed the irritation behind it. She wanted every corner of the house to fit the image she had already created in her mind. As she continued measuring the dining room with a tape measure, I quietly excused myself and walked upstairs to my study. I closed the door behind me and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk with the brass key. Inside was a thick blue folder containing documents Robert had insisted I keep organized. Property records, insurance papers, utility accounts, maintenance agreements, everything connected to this house. Robert used to say, one day, knowing where these papers are will matter more than owning them. At the time, I thought he was talking about emergencies. Now I realized he had been talking about responsibility. As I turned another page, an envelope slipped onto the floor. I had not opened it in years. It was a letter from the property management company that had helped us register the house for seasonal vacation use after Robert retired, allowing us flexibility whenever we traveled. Tucked inside was a detailed occupancy agreement with limits, notification requirements, and responsibilities that only the registered owner could authorize. I slowly read every line again. Downstairs, I could hear Lauren laughing as she told someone over the phone, everything is under control. She believed she understood exactly how this house worked. The truth was, she had never once asked the only person who actually did. The following afternoon, I drove downtown with the blue folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. I told myself I only wanted to confirm that everything I remembered was still accurate. Asheville had changed over the years, but there were places that still felt untouched by time. One of them was the small office on Lexington Avenue where Robert and I had signed so many papers decades earlier. The brick building looked exactly as I remembered it, with polished brass handles on the front door and evergreen wreaths hanging from every window. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up with a warm smile. "Mrs. Parker," she said, "it has been a long time." Before I could answer, a familiar voice echoed from the hallway. Well, if it is not Evelyn Parker. I turned and saw Daniel Brooks walking toward me. His hair had turned almost completely silver since I last saw him, but his steady posture and calm expression had not changed. Years ago, after retiring from the United States Coast Guard, Daniel had become the senior property manager for the company that oversaw vacation homes throughout western North Carolina. Robert trusted him more than anyone else with the legal details surrounding our home whenever we traveled. He reached out his hand with an easy smile. I was hoping I would see you again one day. It has been a while, I said. Far too long, he replied. He noticed the folder under my arm and immediately understood why I had come. Come into my office. His office overlooked the quiet street below. Christmas lights hung from the lampposts outside, and people hurried along the sidewalks carrying shopping bags and steaming cups of coffee. Daniel waited until I sat down before speaking again. How is the house? The house is fine, I answered. It is the people inside it that have become complicated. He nodded gently, as though he had heard that sentence many times throughout his life. I explained what had happened over the past week. I did not exaggerate. I simply described the conversations, the assumptions, and the growing expectation that I would once again carry the entire holiday on my shoulders. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands together. Robert always admired your patience, he said quietly. Sometimes I worried people would mistake it for permission. I looked down at the folder. Maybe they already have. Daniel opened the file and reviewed several pages before sliding one document across the desk toward me. Nothing has changed, he said. You remain the sole registered owner. Every utility account, every seasonal occupancy notification, every maintenance authorization still requires your approval. He tapped another page. And because your property participates in the seasonal management program, there are occupancy limits and activation procedures that exist to protect both you and the property. If someone arrives without those arrangements, I asked, then they are responsible for the consequences of their own assumptions. His answer was calm, not dramatic. It sounded less like a warning than a simple fact. Just then, someone knocked lightly on the open office door. Daniel, your 2 o'clock is here. An older woman stepped inside before noticing me. Oh, she said with surprise. Evelyn Parker? It took me a second to recognize her. Margaret Hughes. She and her late husband had lived 3 houses down from us for nearly 25 years before moving into a nearby retirement community. She smiled so warmly that I found myself smiling back. I have not seen you since Robert's memorial service, she said. You look wonderful. We spoke for a few minutes about old neighbors and familiar faces. Then she looked directly at Daniel. I hope she knows how much people in that neighborhood respect her. I felt embarrassed. Margaret. She gently shook her head. No, let me finish. Turning back toward Daniel, she said, every Christmas after Robert passed away, Evelyn was the one checking on elderly neighbors before she even started cooking for her own family. She delivered meals. She shoveled sidewalks. Half the people on that street still hang decorations because she quietly organized volunteers after the big ice storm. Most people never knew it was her. Daniel smiled knowingly. That sounds exactly like Robert's Evelyn. I suddenly realized how little my own family knew about the life I had built outside those walls. They knew me as the woman who roasted turkey and folded napkins. They had never asked about the widows I visited every December, the food pantry donations, or the neighbors whose Christmas dinners quietly appeared on their porches before sunrise. Those parts of my life had never required recognition, but hearing someone else speak about them reminded me that I had not disappeared. I had simply been invisible to the people closest to me. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused near the doorway. By the way, she said, almost as an afterthought, I drove past your house this morning. There were already delivery trucks dropping off folding tables and extra chairs. It looked like someone was preparing for a very large gathering. My heart sank. I had not authorized a single delivery. Daniel slowly closed the folder in front of him, his expression growing more serious than it had been all afternoon. Evelyn, he said quietly, if people have already begun making arrangements without your approval, we may need to act sooner than either of us expected. Daniel did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply reached for his desk phone, made a brief call, and then turned back toward me with the same calm expression Robert had always admired. "Before anyone else makes another decision involving your property," he said, "let us make sure the records reflect exactly what you want." I nodded. For the first time in years, I realized I was not asking permission from anyone. I was simply exercising responsibilities that had always been mine. Daniel printed several forms and placed them neatly across the desk. "Nothing here changes ownership," he explained. "These documents simply confirm that you will not be occupying the house during Christmas, and that no seasonal hosting services should be activated unless you authorize them personally." I read every page carefully before signing. Robert had taught me never to sign anything I had not fully understood. I could almost hear his voice saying, "Paperwork protects quiet people because it remembers what others conveniently forget." Daniel smiled as he collected the documents. "Robert would be proud of you today." Those words lingered with me far longer than I expected. As I prepared to leave, Margaret caught up with me outside beneath the wreath hanging over the entrance. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the afternoon air. "Would you have time for coffee?" she asked. We walked across the street to a small cafe that Robert and I had visited countless times over the years. The owner recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Parker," he called from behind the counter. "Your usual?" I smiled. "It has been a while." "Some things should never change," he replied as he prepared my coffee without asking another question. Margaret watched the exchange with quiet amusement. "You know," she said after we sat down by the window, "your family probably has no idea how many people know your name around this town." I laughed softly. "I doubt they have ever wondered." Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "Do they know about the foundation?" I looked at her in surprise. "I have never talked about that with them." She nodded, almost as though she had expected the answer. 20 years earlier, after Robert sold his construction company, we quietly established a small charitable foundation in memory of his parents. Every December, it paid heating bills for elderly residents who were struggling through the winter. Local churches, social workers, and community volunteers knew where the assistance came from. We had asked that our names never appear publicly. Robert believed generosity lost something important the moment it became performance. After he died, I continued the work alone. "I saw one of the pastors last week," Margaret said. "He mentioned another family whose furnace was repaired because of your donation." I looked down into my coffee. "Robert always said Christmas should leave people warmer than it found them, and you kept that promise." Her words filled the silence between us more gently than any compliment ever could. My own children had never asked why I sometimes disappeared for a few hours during the holidays. They assumed I was shopping or running errands. They never knew I was delivering groceries to strangers or meeting with local organizations to review emergency assistance before winter storms arrived. I had never hidden those things. They had simply never been curious enough to ask. As we left the cafe, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Lauren appeared in the family group conversation. "Good news, everyone. Catering tables and extra chairs are already arriving. We are almost ready." A photograph followed. I immediately recognized my own front porch. Workers were unloading equipment, while Lauren stood in the driveway directing them with both hands. My chest tightened, not because she had ordered the furniture, but because she looked completely at ease, making decisions she had no authority to make. Before I could respond, another notification appeared. This one came directly from Rebecca. "Mom, are you busy? Michael just called me asking where you keep all the house documents. Something feels off." I stepped beneath the awning outside the cafe and called her instead of texting. She answered on the second ring. "Mom," she said quietly, Why is Michael looking for property papers? Did he say? Only that Lauren wants to make sure everything runs smoothly while you are away. I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel had warned me that assumptions often grow into actions if nobody stops them. Rebecca, I asked gently, did he mention which papers? There was a brief pause before she answered. He specifically asked if Dad ever left instructions about the house. The sounds of downtown Asheville faded into the background. Suddenly, that innocent question carried far more weight than either of us wanted to admit. Robert had, in fact, left instructions. Very specific ones. Instructions that no one besides me and one other person had ever read. And at that exact moment, I realized someone in my own family had begun searching for documents they did not even know existed. Rebecca arrived at my house less than an hour later. The winter sky had already turned pale gray, and the front porch lights cast long shadows across the fresh snow. She stepped inside without saying much, wrapped her arms around me, and held the embrace longer than either of us usually did. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. You never call me in the middle of the afternoon. I smiled softly. I did not want to worry you. She pulled back just enough to look into my face. You have spent your whole life trying not to worry everyone else. We settled into the family room, where the Christmas tree still glowed quietly in the corner. Rebecca looked around the house with a sadness I had not noticed before. It still feels like Dad is here, she said. That was always the idea, I answered. Your father wanted this house to remind people that they belonged, never that they were guests. I walked into my study and returned with a plain white envelope. There was no dramatic seal or thick stack of legal papers inside. Only a handwritten letter Robert had left with instructions that accompanied the official documents stored elsewhere. Rebecca unfolded it carefully. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately. After a long silence, she read one sentence aloud. Our home should never become a reward for entitlement. It should always remain a place built on gratitude, respect, and willing hearts. She lowered the page and looked at me. He knew this day might come. He hoped it never would, I replied. But he believed people sometimes mistake generosity for obligation. Rebecca sat quietly, turning the letter over in her hands. Michael has never seen this? No. Why? I looked toward the family photographs lined across the mantel. Because your father believed lessons about character could not be taught by paperwork. They had to be learned through choices. My phone rang before either of us spoke again. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly. Hi, Michael. His voice sounded rushed. Mom, where are the files Dad kept about the house? Why are you looking for them? There was a brief pause. Lauren just wants to make sure everything is organized before everyone arrives. Everything already is organized, I answered. There is nothing you need to worry about. He let out a quiet sigh. Mom, please. We are only trying to help. I closed my eyes for a moment before responding. Helping begins with asking, Michael, not assuming. The line grew silent. Finally, he spoke again, more softly this time. Are you upset because of Christmas? This conversation is not about Christmas. Then what is it about? I looked across the room at Rebecca, who listened without interrupting. It is about respect. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his confidence seemed smaller than before. Lauren thinks you are overreacting. She is free to think that, I replied. Goodbye, Michael. I ended the call without anger, simply because there was nothing more to say. Rebecca reached over and squeezed my hand. He heard you, she said, maybe for the first time. That evening, I returned to Daniel's office for one final appointment before leaving town. He reviewed every confirmation that had been submitted earlier that day. Everything is complete, he said. Your travel notice has been processed. The property has been recorded as unoccupied by the registered owner during the holiday period. Any additional arrangements would require your direct authorization. I nodded. Thank you. Daniel closed the file. You know, Evelyn, people often think responsibility is about control. It is not. Responsibility is simply accepting the consequences of your own decisions. I smiled faintly. Then everyone is about to learn something. As I stood to leave, his assistant stepped into the office carrying a clipboard. Daniel, the delivery company, called. They said someone claiming to represent the Parker family requested additional portable equipment for the property. Daniel frowned. Did they provide authorization? No, they only used the family name. He looked toward me, then calmly picked up the phone. Please inform them that only the registered owner may approve services connected to that property. The assistant nodded and left. Neither Daniel nor I celebrated the moment. We simply understood that facts were beginning to replace assumptions. When I returned home, I found another vehicle parked across the street. Margaret stood outside, speaking with a man I recognized as the Neighborhood Homeowners Association president, Thomas Reynolds, a retired Air Force colonel known for his fairness and attention to detail. As I stepped out of my car, Thomas greeted me warmly. Mrs. Parker, I was just asking Margaret whether you were expecting unusually heavy traffic over Christmas. Before I could answer, Lauren's SUV pulled into the driveway. She climbed out smiling, completely unaware of the conversation already unfolding in front of my house. Then Thomas looked directly at her and asked one simple question that caused the smile to disappear almost instantly. Mrs. Parker, could you please tell me who gave approval for an event of this size at Evelyn's property? Lauren looked from Colonel Thomas Reynolds to me, then back again, as though waiting for someone else to answer the question for her. The smile she had been wearing only seconds earlier faded into uncertainty. Approval, she repeated. This is a family Christmas. Thomas nodded politely. I understand. My question is simply whether the homeowner approved an event involving this number of guests. Lauren gave a short laugh. Well, of course. We have Christmas here every year. He remained calm. That is not what I asked. The silence stretched long enough for Michael to step out of the passenger side of the sport utility vehicle. He sensed the tension immediately. What is going on? Lauren answered before anyone else could speak. Apparently, we are being questioned about having Christmas dinner. Thomas extended his hand toward Michael. Nothing personal, son. We are only making sure community guidelines and property responsibilities are understood. With delivery trucks, additional parking, and several large equipment rentals arriving, I wanted to confirm everything had been coordinated with the homeowner. Michael looked toward me. Mom? I met his eyes without anger. No one asked me to approve any of those arrangements. He blinked, surprised more than defensive, I thought. His voice faded before the sentence was finished. Lauren quickly stepped in. Michael, you told me your mother would not mind. She turned toward Thomas. This has all been misunderstood. Thomas folded his hands behind his back. Misunderstandings are usually resolved by simple conversations. That is why I came to ask. There was no accusation in his tone, only quiet professionalism. Margaret stood a few feet away beside her mailbox, saying nothing. She did not need to. The truth was already beginning to settle into the cold December air. After Thomas wished everyone a pleasant evening and walked back across the street, nobody moved for several seconds. Finally, Michael looked at me again. Mom, why did you not tell us people had questions? I answered gently. Because no one asked me any questions before making decisions. Lauren crossed her arms. This is becoming much bigger than it needs to be. Is it? Rebecca asked as she stepped onto the porch behind me. Lauren looked surprised to see her. When 30 people are invited into someone else's home without permission, Rebecca continued calmly, it already became something much bigger. Lauren shook her head. I cannot believe everyone is acting like I committed some terrible offense. No one said that, I replied. We are simply talking about choices. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. He looked exhausted, caught between two worlds that had finally collided. Lauren, he said quietly, did you actually tell everyone before asking Mom? She hesitated for the first time since this entire situation had begun. I assumed she would say yes. That is not the same thing, Rebecca answered. Lauren sighed heavily. She always says yes. Those 4 words echoed more loudly than anyone expected. Even Lauren seemed surprised after hearing herself say them out loud. Nobody responded immediately, because there was nothing to argue with. She had unknowingly described the very pattern that had brought us to this moment. Michael lowered his eyes toward the driveway. Maybe we stopped asking. I watched my son carefully. It was the first sentence he had spoken that belonged entirely to him rather than to the expectations around him. Lauren looked at him in disbelief. Michael, seriously? I am only saying. He stopped again, searching for words he had probably avoided for years. Maybe we should have talked to Mom first. Lauren's frustration became visible. Now everyone is making me the villain. I shook my head. This is not about villains. She looked directly at me. Then, what do you want? I answered without raising my voice. For people to understand that kindness is not the same as endless obligation. She looked away. For the first time since I had known her, she had no immediate reply. The following morning, the family group conversation grew strangely quiet. A few relatives who had seen messages about parking restrictions and neighborhood questions began asking practical concerns instead of holiday recipes. Do we still have enough room? One cousin wrote. Should we book a hotel just in case? Another added, who is actually organizing everything? The confidence that had filled the conversation only a day earlier slowly gave way to uncertainty. No one was arguing. They were simply beginning to realize that the foundation beneath their assumptions was much weaker than they had believed. Around noon, Rebecca helped me carry several donation boxes to the community food pantry. Volunteers greeted me by name, thanking me for another year of support. One of them smiled warmly at Rebecca. Your mother never misses Christmas week. Rebecca looked at me with quiet admiration as we walked back to the car. There is so much about you that Michael never knew. I smiled sadly. There was always time to ask. When I returned home that afternoon, my suitcase was waiting beside the front door, exactly where I had left it. My flight to Charleston was scheduled for early the next morning. I placed my passport inside my purse, checked my reservation one last time, and turned off the kitchen lights. Just as I reached for the staircase, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Daniel Brooks. I answered immediately. His normally steady voice carried an unfamiliar note of urgency. Evelyn, he said, I thought you should know that someone contacted our office less than an hour ago claiming to be calling on your behalf. They requested access to records that only the registered owner is allowed to obtain. You need to hear exactly who made that call before you leave tomorrow. Daniel did not keep me waiting. The call came from Michael, he said quietly. He identified himself as your son and asked whether he could obtain copies of ownership records and occupancy authorizations before Christmas. My assistant explained that we could not release anything without the registered owner's permission. I closed my eyes for a moment. Did he argue? No, Daniel replied. He sounded more confused than anything else. I thought you deserved to know because confusion sometimes becomes understanding if people are willing to face it. After I thanked him and ended the call, I sat alone in the living room. The Christmas tree reflected softly in the front window, and I found myself remembering something Robert used to say whenever a project went wrong. Most mistakes are not made in one big moment. They are built one small assumption at a time. That sentence suddenly described the last several years of my life better than anything else ever had. Early the next morning, Rebecca drove me to the Asheville airport. Neither of us talked much during the drive. Before I stepped out of the car, she reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. "Do not answer every phone call," she said with a small smile. "Take your vacation." I smiled back. "I intend to." By the time my plane landed in Charleston, South Carolina, the winter sun was already beginning to sink toward the harbor. The hotel overlooked the water, where sailboats rocked gently against their docks. For the first time in many years, I checked into a room during Christmas week without carrying grocery lists, recipes, or wrapped presents. The receptionist handed me my room key and said, "Welcome, Mrs. Parker. We hope you enjoy a peaceful holiday." The word peaceful stayed with me all the way to my room. It felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. Back in Asheville, however, peace was becoming much harder to find. Around 10 o'clock the following morning, the first cars began arriving at my house. Rebecca later told me what happened, and Margaret quietly filled in the details afterward. Vehicle after vehicle pulled into the neighborhood until the street filled with unfamiliar license plates. Children climbed out carrying overnight bags. Adults unloaded coolers that they assumed would be filled later. One. Relatives walked toward the front porch, expecting the familiar warmth that had greeted them every Christmas before. Instead, they found a locked front door, dark windows, and no smell of food drifting from the kitchen. Lauren arrived shortly afterward, balancing grocery bags in her arms. She stopped when she realized there was no welcoming light inside the house. "Where is your spare key?" one of her cousins asked. Lauren looked toward Michael. "Does your mother always lock the storm door?" Michael reached into his pocket and unlocked the front entrance. When everyone stepped inside, the silence greeted them first. The refrigerator contained little more than milk, butter, and a carton of eggs. The pantry held a few canned goods and coffee. The freezer was almost empty. There were no prepared casseroles, no pies cooling on the counter, no carefully labeled containers waiting for holiday meals. One of Lauren's uncles laughed awkwardly. "Maybe she went shopping this morning." Michael slowly shook his head. "She left yesterday." Lauren immediately reached for her phone. Her first call went unanswered. Then another, then another. Finally, she sent a message asking where all the food was. Minutes later, my phone vibrated in Charleston while I was walking beside the waterfront. I stopped near a bench overlooking the harbor and read her words without feeling anger. They simply sounded different now, stripped of certainty. "Mom, everyone is here. There is nothing in the house. Please call me." A few moments later, another message appeared from Michael. "Mom, we did not realize." I looked across the water before typing a single sentence. "You wanted the house, not the mother." I slipped the phone back into my purse and continued walking. Meanwhile, confusion inside my home slowly turned into uncomfortable honesty. Several relatives quietly asked Lauren whether she had actually spoken to me before inviting everyone. Others wondered why they had been told everything was already arranged. The conversations became quieter, more thoughtful. Nobody shouted, nobody blamed me. Instead, people began looking at one another with the uneasy realization that they had all accepted assumptions without asking a single question. Michael eventually sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty place where I always rolled pie dough every Christmas Eve. Rebecca later told me he rested both hands on the worn oak surface for several minutes before saying almost to himself, "I never thanked her. Not once." Lauren sat across from him, tears filling her eyes more from regret than embarrassment. "I thought she liked doing all of it," she whispered. Michael looked up slowly. Did you ever ask? She lowered her head without answering. Before sunset, many of the relatives quietly booked nearby hotel rooms or changed their travel plans. Several apologized to Michael before leaving, telling him they wished they had known the full story. No one left angry with me. They left saddened by what they had finally understood. That evening, my phone rang one last time. It was Michael. When I answered, his voice was calm, almost unfamiliar. "Mom," he said softly, "when you come home, I think there are some things I need to hear about Dad, and some things I need to say to you." I stood watching the last light fade across Charleston Harbor, realizing that sometimes the first step toward healing is not a dramatic apology. It is the quiet moment when someone finally becomes willing to see the truth they spent years overlooking. When I returned to Asheville 3 days after Christmas, the mountains were wrapped in a quiet blanket of fresh snow. The roads were peaceful, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the familiar exhaustion that usually followed the holidays. Instead, I carried home something much lighter. I carried home the feeling that I had finally stopped apologizing for existing in my own life. Rebecca picked me up at the airport with the same gentle smile she had worn when she dropped me off. We talked about Charleston, the harbor, and the old church bells that echoed through the historic streets each morning. She listened more than she spoke, and somehow that felt like the greatest gift anyone could have given me. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed something unexpected. The folding tables were gone. The extra chairs had disappeared. Even the overflowing trash bins had been emptied. My front porch looked exactly as it always had, with the evergreen wreath still hanging beside the old brass lantern Robert had installed years ago. Michael's truck was parked along the curb. He stepped out before I even turned off the engine. He looked older than he had only a few days before. Not because time had passed, but because something inside him finally had. He walked toward me slowly. "Welcome home, Mom," he said quietly. I smiled. It is good to be home. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he surprised me by wrapping his arms around me the way he had not done since he was a young man. "I am sorry," he whispered. "Not because Christmas went wrong. Because I stopped seeing everything you carried for us." I closed my eyes and hugged him back. "Thank you for saying that." He stepped aside without trying to explain himself any further. That mattered more than a long speech ever could. Inside the house, Lauren was waiting in the kitchen. The same kitchen where only days earlier she had unfolded table runners and assigned responsibilities as though my voice no longer mattered. Now, she stood beside the counter, with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Mrs. Parker," she began before stopping herself. "Evelyn, I owe you an apology." I nodded gently. She took a slow breath. "I spent years believing your kindness meant you enjoyed carrying everything alone. I never realized I had stopped asking what you wanted." Tears filled her eyes, but she did not ask me to make her feel better. She simply accepted the weight of her own words. "I cannot change what I did," she continued, "but I can change what I do next." I looked at her for a long moment. That is all any of us can do. She reached into her purse and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. It was a handwritten plan for next year's Christmas. Every family member had volunteered to bring meals, decorate, clean, and help with expenses. At the bottom, one sentence stood out above all the others: "Only if Evelyn wants to host." I smiled softly. That is a much better beginning. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and wonderfully different. Michael visited more often, but never without calling first. Sometimes he came only to share coffee on the porch. Other times, we looked through Robert's old photo albums together. He asked questions he had never asked before. What was Dad like before I was born? How did you two decide to buy this house? What made you start the foundation? Each answer seemed to reconnect him with parts of our family history that had quietly disappeared beneath years of routine. Lauren began volunteering at the same community food pantry where I had spent so many Christmas seasons. One Saturday morning, I watched from across the room as she loaded groceries into the trunk of an elderly woman's car. She did not post photographs. She did not tell anyone afterward. She simply helped. When she returned inside, she caught my eye and smiled. It was the first smile I had seen from her that asked for nothing in return. Even Margaret noticed the difference. One afternoon, she joined me on the front porch with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "The neighborhood feels quieter," she said. "No," I answered with a smile. "It feels more peaceful." Daniel stopped by a few weeks later to deliver updated property records after a routine annual review. Before leaving, he handed me the familiar blue folder. "Looks like everything is exactly where it belongs," he said. I thanked him, then carried the folder upstairs to my study. I unlocked the bottom drawer with the small brass key that had rested there throughout this entire journey. For a moment, I simply held the key in my hand. At the beginning of this Christmas, I had believed it protected a house. Now I understood it represented something much greater. It protected my boundaries, my choices, and the quiet dignity Robert had hoped I would never surrender. I placed the key back into the drawer and gently closed it, knowing I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The people who truly loved me now understood that love cannot survive where gratitude disappears, and those who finally accepted responsibility found a chance to rebuild trust instead of demanding forgiveness. If you have ever found yourself giving so much that people began believing your sacrifices were simply your job, I hope you remember this. Boundaries do not push good people away. They teach others how to love you with respect. Your kindness is a gift, not an obligation, and your peace is worth protecting. If this story touched your heart, I would truly appreciate it if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. Sometimes the strongest act of love is quietly choosing not to abandon yourself anymore. Thank you for spending this journey with me. Until our paths cross again in another story, I hope your home is filled with peace, your heart is filled with hope, and you never forget that the people who deserve a seat at your table are the ones who never forget the person who prepared it.